I am the Swarm. Author, Quantum Wizard. Chapter 51, Observation. At Luo Wen's command, tens of thousands of burrower ants were the first to be mobilized, heading to the construction site of the new brood nest. They were soon joined by over 20,000 worker ants tasked with logistical support. These ants were responsible for transporting food to meet the daily needs of the burrower ants. Additionally, they handled soil relocation and the reinforcement of newly dug tunnels. In the past, Luo Wen personally led the excavation of the hive. However, now that he commanded tens of thousands of subordinates, there was no need for the highest-ranking commander to dirty his claws. Although there was no longer anything in the vicinity that could threaten the hive, Luo Wen maintained his characteristically cautious style. At a depth of 3 meters underground, the burrower ants constructed an impressive labyrinth of tunnels, intended as a decoy and transit hub, a fake brood nest. The real brood nest was located 3 to 4 meters below the fake one. This true hive, also a network of tunnels, was connected to the decoy by a single passage. Both ends of the passage were stocked with loose soil, ready to be sealed at a moment's notice. A team of spy bugs and burrower ants was stationed there permanently. Their mission was to seal the passage and deploy misleading pheromones if intruders breached the decoy, ensuring the true hive remained hidden. Luo Wen didn't see this strategy as overly cautious, it was simply prudent. He was wary of the Yellow Earth Ant Legion atop the cliff. If one day they lost their footing and charged straight down the slope, Luo Wen's hive would be their first target. Though the hive had grown much stronger, the gap in power between it and the Yellow Earth Ant Legion was still insurmountable. Direct confrontation remained out of the question, evasion was the safer strategy. Luo Wen firmly believed in the adage, preserve the green hills, and you'll never run out of firewood. He swore he would avenge his past grievances, eventually. Despite the ambitious scale of the new brood nest, it was completed at an impressive speed thanks to the collective efforts of tens of thousands of ants. With the old hive set to be abandoned, Luo Wen no longer needed to hold back. Personally digging his way down, he and the worker ants carefully dragged the massive brood nest to the surface. The brood nest, tireless and sleepless, consumed vast amounts of food daily, converting it into energy. Most of this energy went toward producing eggs, while the remainder fueled its own growth. Its sheer size only became apparent during the move. Now larger than Luo Wen himself, the brood nest's rotund form dwarfed the surrounding ants. Even with multiple tunnel expansions, its bulk barely fit through the passages. To put it into perspective, if Luo Wen was the size of a plate, the brood nest was like a giant watermelon. Worker ants, no larger than a fingernail, seemed like tiny specks around it. Countless worker ants swarmed beneath the brood nest, forming a layered platform to carry it. After numerous adjustments, the platform began to move. Luo Wen didn't participate directly. As the hive's supreme commander and strongest combatant, he focused on overseeing the operation and ensuring its security. After several hundred meters of careful relay work, the worker ants successfully transported the brood nest to its new location without incident. In the following days, the main passage and the brood nest's chamber were further widened. At last, the brood nest settled into its new home. The main passage was then narrowed once more, restored to its original state. The move to the new hive was a success, though there was no one to share Luo Wen's joy. By now, he was accustomed to the solitude of a life without social interaction. The swarm returned to its steady rhythm of growth, resting, expanding, exterminating ant nests, absorbing territories, a repetitive cycle. Hundreds of days and nights passed, and the swarm once again approached the limits of its expansion. Luo Wen, however, already had a solution in mind, establishing branch bases. This idea had been on his mind for some time, and he had conducted several experiments. Initially, he used the queen ant's genes as a template, attempting to hatch a few hive-specific queens. These queens developed normally from eggs to maturity but failed to produce eggs once fully grown. Despite multiple rounds of experiments, the results remained unchanged. Luo Wen racked his brains but couldn't pinpoint the issue. Could the problem lie with the brood nest's queens being defective? Suspecting otherwise, Luo Wen decided to observe an ant colony for answers. He captured a colony of black ants, killed their queen and most of their members, and reduced their size for easier observation. This colony was confined indoors, with any ants attempting to leave promptly driven back by guard ants stationed outside the nest. Worker ants from the hive delivered food to the colony's entrance daily. Luo Wen dug a passage connecting to the colony and used his body to block the opening. His camouflage and pheromone abilities allowed him to blend seamlessly into the colony, making him as inconspicuous as a stone. Not a single black ant showed curiosity about him. To ensure no details were missed, Luo Wen gave up foraging. Worker ants periodically delivered his food through the passage. Luo Wen merely needed to turn slightly to eat before resuming his position. Prepared for a prolonged operation, Luo Wen was surprised by how quickly answers emerged. After losing their queen, the worker ants somehow managed to hatch several new queens and some strange ants Luo Wen had never seen before. Once the queens matured, they engaged in unspeakable acts with these peculiar ants. Shortly afterward, the strange ants perished without exception. Luo Wen discreetly used his adhesive claws to collect the corpses of these peculiar ants. Meanwhile, internal conflict erupted within the colony, as the new queens led their factions in a brutal power struggle. The defeated queens were killed mercilessly, while their followers surrendered to the victor. By the end of the war, only one queen remained, commanding the allegiance of all surviving ants. The colony resumed its familiar rhythm, laying eggs and raising larvae. Midway through this process, Luo Wen had already figured out the problem. But since he was bored, he decided to watch the drama unfold to its conclusion, treating it as entertainment. The peculiar ants, likely male ants, appeared only during the colony's early stages. After mating, they died shortly thereafter. When Luo Wen infiltrated ant colonies in the past, they had all been large, established nests with thousands of members, so he had never encountered male ants. The issue with the brood nest's queens lay in the absence of these males to complete the process. Chapter 52, Branch Bases. This was an oversight Luo Wen hadn't anticipated, a blind spot in his thinking. Beyond his lack of familiarity with male ants, there was another factor: the brood nest had always produced eggs without needing external involvement. Perhaps the brood nest instinctively knew that if it required such a process, Luo Wen might have eliminated it long before it reached its current size. With the issue identified, Luo Wen extracted genetic fragments from the male ants. The brood nest soon began producing eggs for a few male ants. In time, the queens successfully laid eggs. However, the hatchlings were ordinary, unmodified ants free of any advanced biological features. Fortunately, these creatures still obeyed Luo Wen's commands. Apart from their pheromone-based identification system, they also inherited the dual friend or foe recognition system characteristic of brood nest creations. Yet, this outcome fell far short of Luo Wen's expectations. He wasn't here to raise ordinary ants. If the swarm couldn't grow stronger alongside him, what would be the point of the collective's energy? Determined to achieve better results, Luo Wen conducted further experiments. Although the brood nest's origins lay in the genes of black ant queens, its mutations had transformed it beyond recognition. Luo Wen experimented with various combinations of his own genes and those of the brood nest. After countless trials, he finally devised a passable solution. The queens hatched using this new formula operated more like miniature versions of the brood nest. They could lay eggs without the need for male ants and even utilize optimized genetic combinations to produce specialized insects, such as burrower ants and spy bugs. However, they had their limitations. Firstly, their gene libraries were fixed the moment they detached from the brood nest. Unlike the brood nest, they couldn't synchronize with Luo Wen to continuously update their genetic repertoire. Secondly, they lacked the brood nest's capacity for relentless energy conversion. Bound by their smaller appetites and limited time, their growth was slower, and their egg production couldn't compare to that of the brood nest. These flaws, though inconvenient, could be mitigated. For example, the first issue could be resolved by periodically producing new queens to refresh the gene library. As for the second issue, while individual output was limited, there was no restriction on the number of queens that could exist. If one wasn't enough, produce 2. If 2 weren't sufficient, try 10 or 100. The swarm's expansion accelerated dramatically. Simultaneously, the first batch of 10 experimental queen eggs was produced. While these queens matured, the swarm launched a frenzied offensive, wiping out dozens of ant nests in a short time. None of the 30-plus ant nests that once provided food for the hive were spared. All were annihilated, and their territories absorbed into the swarm. However, due to the distance, the new territories couldn't yet be developed or guarded. This was only a temporary issue. As the 10 queens matured, it was time for them to play their roles. Luo Wen equipped each queen with 300 burrower ants, 700 worker ants, and 50 soldier ants as their personal guard units. After assembly, the 10 teams set off in different directions toward the front lines. Their mission was to establish branch bases in the new territories, create additional aphid pastures, and utilize local resources to increase their numbers. They were also tasked with safeguarding their territories and the brood nest itself. Luo Wen was thrilled. If these experimental seeds proved successful, the swarm's growth would reach unprecedented levels. Finally, the prospect of defeating the Yellow Earth Ant Legion and avenging past grievances was within reach. Despite the emergence of branch queens, the brood nest's production continued unabated. After replenishing the forces assigned to the 10 queens, all new mature individuals were sent to support the front lines and branch bases. The queens, still limited in production capacity, focused on nurturing themselves while the branches grew steadily under the brood nest's support. As the branch bases expanded and the number of insects increased, new aphid pastures began to appear around them. The experiment proceeded smoothly. In the following weeks, the swarm resumed its relentless march of expansion. One by one, over 20 additional queens were dispatched with their personal guards to establish new branch bases in fresh territories. As the branch bases proliferated across the region, the swarm's activity radius grew significantly. Unlike independent black ant colonies, which formed separate systems with unique identification protocols, the brood nest's queens functioned as extensions of the hive. All branches shared the same identification system and pheromone-based network as the central hive. Insects from any branch could freely access the brood nest and other bases for rest and resupply. Luo Wen remained their supreme commander. Time flew by, with a new queen team departing every few days to secure new territories. Backed against the cliff, the swarm's influence now extended along the eastern lake's shoreline, rapidly expanding northward. Upon reaching the lake's northern end, the swarm split into two forces, one continued north, while the other followed the lake's edge eastward. Eventually, the eastern force encountered a river flowing from the lake. Turning north along the river, they rejoined the northern force. Meanwhile, a western force of 30,000 insects advanced westward. When the hive was weaker, Luo Wen had avoided the lake, staying as far away as possible. As a human, he had harbored an unexplainable fear of deep water. After becoming an insect, even small puddles seemed bottomless to him. Fear of the unknown only deepened his caution. He couldn't be sure what terrifying creatures might lurk underwater. As the swarm grew stronger, Luo Wen dispatched scouts to patrol the area. Nothing unusual occurred, though he climbed tall plants near the shore to observe the lake from a distance. Despite the calm surface, he couldn't see beneath the water. Over time, Luo Wen's wariness subsided. Though the swarm patrolled the area, he never expanded their territory to the lake. Now, however, the hive encompassed half the lake shore. Ironically, Luo Wen found himself hoping something would emerge from the lake. Perhaps it could offer new genetic fragments for his collection. It had been far too long since his gene library had been updated. Alas, the lake's creatures adhered to a live and let live philosophy, showing no inclination to come ashore. Chapter 53, A New Enemy. As the hive continued to expand, a new problem emerged before Luo Wen. This issue was long-distance communication. With nearly 100 branch bases established, the network was vast. While the bases remained steadfastly loyal to Luo Wen's commands, he was completely unaware of their individual situations. And Luo Wen had no idea how to solve this problem. His knowledge was limited, making it impossible for him to create communication devices suitable for his swarm. Additionally, the insects' low intelligence rendered them incapable of acting as effective messengers or accurately reporting the statuses of the various branch bases. Thus, Luo Wen, who had been enjoying a relatively leisurely life, became busy once again. He began traveling daily to inspect the conditions of each branch base personally. The more he saw, the more astonished he became at the vastness of his territory. Merely doing a cursory circuit of all the branch bases took 3 full days and nights. If he stopped for a detailed inspection, the time required would double. The first round of inspections was accompanied by a sense of novelty and wonder at his expanding domain. By the second round, Luo Wen was already beginning to grow weary. By the third round, his thoughts had emptied, and his gaze had grown vacant. Luo Wen knew this couldn't go on. At this rate, as his territory continued to expand, he would work himself to death. He had to come up with a solution. But no matter how hard he racked his brains, he couldn't think of anything. So, the issue was postponed. After completing several rounds of inspections without encountering any anomalies, Luo Wen reduced the frequency of his patrols, opting to do them once every 10 days or so. But it was precisely during one of these patrols that an unexpected incident occurred. During a new round of inspections, Luo Wen discovered that the insects in one branch base including the queen ant had mysteriously disappeared. After multiple rounds of genetic adjustments, the queen ants had become emotionless and machine-like in their loyalty, eliminating any possibility of betrayal. This meant that they must have encountered some external factor that led to the current situation. Luo Wen dug into the nest to examine the remaining traces carefully. Pheromone residues were abundant everywhere. Upon analyzing them, Luo Wen made a discovery. The pheromones originated from the base's inhabitants and an unknown force. From the scent profiles, the unknown force seemed to be another ant species, similar to his own, but the violent and savage undertones revealed through the pheromones indicated they were far from as docile or disciplined as black ants. Luo Wen's first guess was the Yellow Earth Ant Legion. Could they have established a branch nearby? But he quickly dismissed this theory. The characteristics of the pheromones were completely different from the Yellow Earth ants. This was an entirely new ant species. Moreover, judging by the state of the branch base, their methods bore an unsettling resemblance to his own. Faced with the emergence of an aggressive neighbor, Luo Wen dared not be careless. He followed the pheromone trails, tracing them meticulously. Maintaining his characteristic caution, Luo Wen advanced slowly, frequently pausing to observe his surroundings and prepare to retreat at the first sign of danger. By now, his swarm consisted of over 100 branch bases, though rapid expansion had stretched his forces thin. Each base had an average of only about 2,000 insects. Even so, Luo Wen commanded a total of 200,000 insect followers. As their supreme commander, Luo Wen had to act with caution, his responsibility to his subordinates demanded it. If the insects weren't so woefully unintelligent, Luo Wen wouldn't even be handling the reconnaissance himself. Sitting safely in the rear and directing his army on the front lines was the image he preferred to embody. The pheromone trails led north, eventually leaving the hive's territory, before branching out in multiple directions. Luo Wen arbitrarily chose one path and followed it, arriving at an unfamiliar black ant nest. Unfortunately, he was once again too late. This nest was also abandoned, its inhabitants having disappeared without a trace. With no other choice, Luo Wen selected another trail that diverged from this point. After circling around for some time, he ultimately returned to the hive's territory and arrived at another branch base. Luckily, this time he wasn't late. A fierce battle was unfolding at the base's entrance. Amid the chaos, Luo Wen finally caught sight of the enemy. They were small ants, only about half the size of a black ant worker. Their heads and thoraxes were an eerie dark red, while their eyes, mandibles, abdomens, and legs were black with reddish hues. In addition to their standard ant features and unconventional coloration, they possessed short, sharp stingers at the ends of their abdomens, a clear indicator of their unique combat ability. Although their size was small, their numbers were overwhelming, and they were ferociously aggressive. The forwardmost branch base had limited insect forces to begin with, essentially the standard outpost contingent assigned to remote areas, roughly 1,000 worker ants and 50 soldier ants. These defenders were rapidly losing ground. Dozens of soldier ant corpses were scattered near the base entrance, and the surviving soldier ants were few. As the main combat force and frontline shield, the soldier ants had been nearly wiped out. The remaining worker ants had also suffered heavy losses, with fewer than 300 still alive. They were now desperately defending the narrow entrance under the leadership of the remaining soldier ants. In contrast, the attacking red ants numbered at least 3,000. Strangely, their ranks also included many black ants, roughly another 3,000. Could it be that I've destroyed too many black ant nests recently? Did they go find reinforcements to seek revenge? Luo Wen was stunned. With the limited intelligence of black ants, could they even coordinate with reinforcements? Or was there more to the story? But there was no time for speculation. The dire situation demanded his immediate action. After ensuring there were no ambushes nearby, Luo Wen entered the battlefield. The red ants were no match for Luo Wen's overwhelming force. Despite their agility, they couldn't withstand his brute strength. Luo Wen's digging limbs swung wildly, smashing ants left and right. Even without precision, his sheer force incapacitated numerous red ants with each strike. Meanwhile, his walking limbs, tipped with sharp, spear-like claws, stabbed at the red ants with lightning speed, targeting their heads and abdomens, their largest and most vulnerable areas. Before long, Luo Wen's digging and walking limbs were covered in sticky fluids, and the ground around him was littered with red ant corpses. Standing amidst the carnage, Luo Wen exuded an aura of invincibility, evoking the image of an unstoppable force mowing down enemies. But this was a skirmish involving over 3,000 red ants. No matter how formidable Luo Wen was, his influence on the battle was limited. Moreover, his presence had drawn the attention of the red ant army. Though he had ambushed and killed dozens of them, the majority now turned their focus on him. Chapter 54, Tracking. Faced with the onslaught of hundreds of red ants, Luo Wen swiftly dispatched a few of the vanguard attackers. However, the red ants showed no fear, the sight of their companions being killed did nothing to deter them. Instead, they seized the openings in Luo Wen's attacks and quickly closed in on him. Luo Wen's 8 legs moved rapidly, stabbing through one red ant after another. He flung their lifeless bodies away before thrusting down again. But there were simply too many red ants. Despite killing a handful, the remainder quickly swarmed up his legs, crawling toward his body. While the red ant's small size and limited weaponry posed no real threat to Luo Wen's armor, his head presented 2 glaring weak points that he couldn't afford to leave exposed to their chaos. Just as Luo Wen was preparing to act, a sharp pain flared from one of his leg joints. The sensation shocked him. This was the first time Luo Wen had felt pain since transforming into an insect. Even during extreme injuries, like being gutted, he had felt nothing. Yet now, he was in agony, and the pain only intensified. It was as if his tissue was melting, forcing a pained cry from him. What in the world? When did I develop a nervous system capable of pain? Luo Wen thought angrily. The sharp pain severely hampered his combat ability. Is this evolution or regression? If it's evolution, I'd rather do without it. Unfortunately, there was no time to dwell on his misfortune. Glancing at the source of his pain, he saw a red ant clinging to his leg joint. Its stinger had penetrated the thinner part of his armor, causing the excruciating sensation. A simple sting shouldn't have caused such intense pain. Luo Wen realized with horror, these little bastards use venom. How underhanded! Using another leg, he extended its adhesive tip, grabbed the offending red ant, ripped it away, and brought it to his mouth. Luo Wen crushed the ant into pulp with a furious bite. But in the brief moment of distraction, more red ants had climbed onto his body. They were clearly targeting the weaker joints in his armor and seemed eager to showcase their collective talents. Every hair on Luo Wen's body stood on end in alarm. Without hesitation, he began thrashing his legs and rolling wildly on the ground. Thankfully, his legs had a total of 7 joints, so even if 1 or 2 were disabled, he could still function effectively. Additionally, the smooth surface of his armor offered little to grip, and the red ants lacked the fine hair-like structures that spiders use for climbing. Luo Wen's chaotic rolling dislodged most of the ants clinging to his body. When Luo Wen stopped, only 3 red ants remained stubbornly attached to his leg joints. Their end, however, was even grimmer. They were individually grabbed by his adhesive limbs, ripped away, and crushed to death. The searing pain had cleared Luo Wen's head. This isn't a game, and I'm no invincible warrior mowing down hordes. A single mistake here could lead to my downfall. Resolving not to linger in battle, Luo Wen began retreating, his 8 legs moving swiftly as he ran and leaped toward the base entrance. Victory in this fight was impossible with the forces at hand. The only sensible choice was to retreat. Pheromones dispersed into the air, signaling his insects. Some climbed onto Luo Wen's back to protect his vulnerable eyes, while others retreated into the tunnels. Switching tactics, Luo Wen abandoned the goal of killing as many ants as possible. Instead, his 2 front legs swung back and forth, knocking away any red ants that came close. This defensive strategy allowed him to cover most directions on his own, leaving the remaining areas to the surviving soldier and worker ants. Before long, the worker ants inside the tunnels emerged, carrying the queen ant. Luo Wen extended a leg, stuck the queen ant to its adhesive tip, and placed her on his back. The remaining soldier and worker ants scrambled up after her, forming a small tower on his back. As the insect defenders evacuated the perimeter, the red ants pushed closer. Seeing the remaining dozens of ants struggling to climb aboard, Luo Wen sighed inwardly. He couldn't save everyone. He issued a final retreat order, wishing them luck, and bolted out of the battlefield at full speed. Along the way, he scattered random pheromones to confuse any pursuers. Some red ants followed his trail for a while but became disoriented by the mixed signals and eventually turned back. Luo Wen wasn't one to hold grudges, but being forced to flee like a whipped dog wasn't his style either unless his enemy was as formidable as the Yellow Earth Ant Legion. After finding a safe spot, Luo Wen set down the survivors. They included 1 queen ant, 3 soldier ants, and a group of worker ants. He assigned 3 soldier ants and 10 workers to escort the queen ant back to the rear. The rest were instructed to search for the Northern Army, ordering them to retreat and halt any advances to avoid clashing with the red ants without his leadership. At this stage, Luo Wen still knew too little about the red ants. As the saying goes, know your enemy and know yourself. He needed to gather more information about them before planning his next move. For now, strategic avoidance was the best course of action. The Northern Army should be nearby, but due to the lack of communication tools, Luo Wen had to rely on spreading worker ants across the area to locate them. Once the army retreated, they would be redistributed among the branch bases. If the army remained stationary instead of advancing, consuming prey and destroying nests to sustain themselves, they would face serious supply issues. The hive currently lacked an effective supply chain, so dispersing them across bases would allow them to be supported locally while also bolstering defenses. With everything arranged, Luo Wen examined his injuries. The joint on his poisoned leg had mostly healed thanks to his remarkable regeneration ability. The red ant's venom was potent, akin to spider venom, capable of dissolving tissue. However, their small size meant that the quantity of venom they could deliver wasn't enough to inflict serious damage on Luo Wen. Still, he had no desire to experience such pain again. And if their numbers were large enough, they could indeed threaten his life. During the battle, Luo Wen had devoured several red ants. If his genetic assimilation was successful, the next batch of eggs might yield insects equipped with stingers. Satisfied that his injuries were manageable, Luo Wen returned to the previous base. He needed to track the red ants to uncover their purpose in attacking his base, their origin, and the mystery behind the involvement of the black ants. These questions demanded answers. Chapter 55, Preparing for Battle, 1. When Luo Wen returned to the branch base, he saw black ants emerging from the tunnels. They were carrying not only food but also eggs, larvae, and pupae, and surprisingly, they didn't seem to be killing them. Are they planning to adopt these larvae? Luo Wen wondered, puzzled. At the same time, he noticed another strange phenomenon. The ones working were exclusively black ants, while the red ants stood idly by, showing no intention of helping. They appeared to be loafing about. An uncontrollable thought sprang to Luo Wen's mind. Could the theory he had jokingly entertained earlier actually be the truth? He adjusted his pheromones to disguise his identity and cautiously approached while observing their reactions, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Fortunately, the pheromone disguise still worked on the red ants, who didn't react to his approach. However, some red ants, for reasons unknown, suddenly began fighting each other. More than a dozen red ants locked jaws and wrestled fiercely, forming a chaotic melee surrounded by a large circle of spectators. Is this their idea of entertainment? Luo Wen mused. The erratic behavior of these tiny creatures baffled him, and he couldn't discern their behavioral patterns. Erring on the side of caution, Luo Wen refrained from venturing deeper into enemy territory. If one of these dim-witted ants decided to challenge him to a test of strength due to his size, it might blow his cover. Circling the enemy, he observed a critical detail: both the red ants and the black ants shared the same pheromone markers. This meant they were on the same side. The red ants weren't hired reinforcements but part of the same group. This discovery reinforced Luo Wen's earlier suspicion. After a while, the black ants finished clearing out the branch base, and the army, laden with spoils, began their march. Luo Wen immediately followed at a safe distance. The combined force of thousands of red and black ants soon merged with another detachment, forming an army of over 10,000 ants. They left Luo Wen's hive territory and veered off to destroy another black ant nest, looting its resources and larvae. By now, nearly every black ant carried some cargo. The united army resumed their march, this time heading straight back to their home base without diversion. Their destination lay more than 500 meters from Luo Wen's territory. As it came into view, Luo Wen saw a towering mound with a massive entrance resembling a volcanic crater. Countless red and black ants swarmed across the mound's surface. The recently returned army filed into the entrance with their spoils, but Luo Wen halted his advance. Without knowing what might trigger the red ants to start fighting opponents, Luo Wen wasn't about to charge recklessly into their lair. The interior was an unknown danger zone. If his cover was blown and hundreds or even thousands of venomous red ants surrounded him, he might not make it out alive. Luo Wen burrowed underground to scout the area. The nest's subterranean structure was vast, far exceeding any black ant nest he had ever encountered. Given the red ants' size, combined with the addition of numerous black ants, their numbers were staggering, easily exceeding tens of thousands. This was an alarming figure. Even though Luo Wen's hive boasted over 200,000 insects, most were dispersed across various bases to maintain operations. He could muster only tens of thousands for combat. That didn't account for the resources needed for transportation and supply lines. In a prolonged conflict, at least half his forces would need to focus on logistics. This war wasn't going to be easy. Yet given the habits of both sides, one of them was bound to be eliminated. Emerging from the ground, Luo Wen continued to shadow the Red Ant army, occasionally launching ambushes to capture a few red ants for food. Over several days of observation, Luo Wen learned more about the red ants. Their behavior resembled bandits. They didn't produce anything themselves but survived by looting. Their numbers far exceeded those in their lair. Numerous red ant detachments operated far from the nest, targeting primarily black ant colonies. They stormed the nests, killing the queen ants. For some reason, after the queens were killed, most surviving black ants submitted to the red ants. Those who refused were swiftly executed, while the rest were tasked with transporting resources and larvae. Red ant squads, typically numbering 2,000 to 3,000, returned with several times their number in black ants. Once brought back, the black ants tended to the larvae and searched the surrounding areas for aphids to farm. They also served as the red ants' reserve food supply. The red ants that attacked Luo Wen's branch base had likely returned early because they failed to subjugate additional black ants and were short on manpower. Thinking of the larvae taken from his branch base, Luo Wen's heart grew heavy. Though they resembled black ants, they were entirely different. They wouldn't submit to the red ants, and their fate was grim. The information Luo Wen had gathered troubled him. Based on his estimates, the red ant population alone exceeded 100,000. And that didn't include those operating too far afield to observe. On top of that, the black ants, numbering several times more than the red ants, were now loyal to them. These black ants didn't just refrain from resisting, they actively assisted the red ants, even joining their attacks. And in the red ant stronghold, where most red ants were out raiding, the sheer number of black ants far exceeded the remaining red ants. Yet there was no sign of rebellion, proving their unwavering loyalty. Perhaps the situation still held some variables. Luo Wen resolved to examine the genetic fragments he'd collected from the red ants upon returning to the brood nest. Perhaps they held hidden secrets that could explain their dominance over the black ants. With his reconnaissance complete, Luo Wen hurried back. The situation was dire. He was no longer planning to attack the red ants. Given their scale, Luo Wen lacked the means to eradicate them for now. If handled poorly, he might even face their counterattack. Traveling quickly, Luo Wen avoided several red ant patrols and entered his own territory. On his way, he stopped by a branch base to dispatch dozens of messenger teams, ordering all bases to bolster defenses. If they encountered the enemy, they were to immediately request reinforcements from nearby bases. After repelling the attackers, pursuit was strictly forbidden. Thanks to the brood nest's growth and the mixing of multiple genetic traits, the intelligence of Luo Wen's insects had improved significantly. The queen ants, in particular, seemed to have an innate intelligence boost. They could now understand more complex commands and had high priority in directing worker and soldier ants. Finally, Luo Wen felt like he had some semblance of military strategy. If he had to rely on the likes of Black 2 and Black 3's early intelligence, they'd never grasped the concept of mutual aid among bases. Chapter 56, Preparing for Battle, 2. After arranging the frontline operations, Luo Wen wasted no time and rushed back to the hive's main base. Upon reconnecting with the brood nest and conducting a thorough examination, he was surprised to find no genetic fragments from the red ants that could explain their ability to subjugate black ants. This was terrible news, and Luo Wen was at a loss. The red ants weren't using some genetic skill to dominate the black ants, could it be their charisma? Are you kidding me? Luo Wen thought incredulously. Still, though the reason eluded him, the outcome was clear. Not dwelling on this mystery for too long, Luo Wen shifted his focus to adjusting the worker ant template. Originally, he intended to integrate the red ant stingers into the worker ant's design. However, he discovered that the stinger was incompatible with the acid spray system. The conflict was not only positional, both systems required the same area at the rear of the body but also internal, with overlapping storage chambers for venom and acid. Faced with a choice, Luo Wen began to deliberate. Suddenly, inspiration struck. He realized that although the red ants were smaller than the black ants, their specialization in combat overproduction marked them as akin to soldier ants. This shift in perspective explained their exceptional ferocity. So, they're essentially a species where every member is a soldier ant, Luo Wen concluded. No wonder they were so aggressive. With this revelation, Luo Wen used the red ant template as a base, first altering their red pigmentation to black for uniformity in his forces. He then added features like acid-resistant armor, enhanced spring-like movement, reinforced chitin plating, and stronger mandibles. The resulting new ant type was a small soldier ant. These creatures were entirely combat-focused and undertook no production tasks. Their size matched that of the red ants, but they were stronger, with thicker armor and larger, tougher mandibles. Though slightly less agile than the red ants, the addition of the spring-like movement compensated for this drawback. Luo Wen gave them a simple name, small soldier ants. Not stopping there, Luo Wen developed 2 additional new species. The first was based on spiders, incorporating his own eye genes, the black beetle's carapace, and chitin-reinforced legs. This new species, called the transport bug, was designed for logistics. Using spiders as the base allowed for a large body size, and their nimble legs made them quick and agile. The beetle's wide back provided ample space for carrying materials. While primarily a support species, the transport bugs were no pushovers in combat. Their legs, sheathed in bone armor, could transform into spears, piercing enemies with precision aided by high-resolution vision. Luo Wen had personally tested this design and found it highly effective. The second species was a pure support unit named the adhesive bug. Modeled after regular worker ants, they were enhanced with the camouflage bug's adhesive traits. Their role was to assist the transport bugs by using their adhesive abilities to secure loads on their carriers' backs. Once the materials reached their destination, the adhesive would dissolve to aid unloading. Logistics would be crucial in the war against the red ants, especially given both sides' reliance on foraging and plundering for sustenance. In a prolonged conflict, the first to lose their supply lines would fall. The red ants, with their captive black ants serving as living food reserves and expendable soldiers, posed a unique challenge. What a headache, Luo Wen muttered, narrowing his eyes. If possible, he'd need to find a way to disrupt their operations. For now, though, Luo Wen focused on preparation. Due to the high energy demands of producing queen ants, the brood nest only produced 50, then switched to mass producing the 3 new species. The first batch of new queens would take time to mature. Until then, the production of the new species fell solely on the brood nest. Luo Wen ordered the existing queens to concentrate on producing worker ants. Worker ants were the swarm's only ranged attackers and were essential for reclaiming and developing territory after defeating the red ants. Their numbers needed to grow as much as possible. With the rear operations in order, Luo Wen returned to the front lines. His lingering concerns about his swarm's adaptability made his presence reassuring. In the following days, messenger units crisscrossed the territory, relaying Luo Wen's orders. He personally conducted reconnaissance in enemy-controlled areas, observing the red ants mobilizing their forces. Numerous detachments returned from foraging and began amassing along the border. The joint red-black ant army swelled to an estimated 200,000, with their numbers continuing to rise. The enemy swept through the borderlands, occasionally sending small raiding parties into the hive's territory to harass and sabotage. 2 branch bases, too remote for timely reinforcements, were overrun and destroyed. However, most bases successfully repelled attacks with the timely arrival of reinforcements, driving the red ants away. The situation grew increasingly dire. A full-scale war was imminent. On Luo Wen's side, the newly developed species matured. From above, one could see large numbers of transport bugs marching on their 8 long legs toward the front lines. Some carried food, while others bore swarms of small soldier ants on their backs. Small soldier ants, due to their small size and limited energy reserves, weren't suited for long marches. Using transport bugs to carry them conserved resources. Though outnumbered, the swarm forces concentrated their troops and adopted a defensive strategy. Meanwhile, the vast outer territories became hunting grounds for the Red Ant Army. Their foraging sustained their massive numbers despite weaker logistical capabilities. As the first 50 new queens reached maturity, they were escorted to the front lines by dedicated teams of transport bugs and guards. There, they began mass-producing small soldier ants on site. The brood nest, meanwhile, ceased small soldier ant production. After producing 10 more queens, it shifted entirely to creating transport bugs and adhesive bugs, reducing the burden of transporting small soldier ants. At the same time, restrictions on the aphid farms were lifted, drawing heavily on the swarm's vegetative reserves to maximize food production. When the first batches of small soldier ants emerged from their pupae, Luo Wen issued an order to redeploy the burrower ants from across the territory to the front lines. The burrower ants, previously tasked with digging tunnels and later relegated to fertilizing vegetation, now had a new purpose in Luo Wen's plan. Far-off groups of burrower ants rode on transport bugs, while closer ones traveled on foot. Over the next few days, they steadily arrived at their designated positions. Luo Wen tallied their numbers, which totaled over 50,000, representing 80% of the hive's burrower ants. Chapter 57, The Home Raid Begins. Luo Wen didn't want to stir up trouble just yet. The longer he could delay, the more advantageous it was for him. The foundation accumulated by the swarm required time to be converted into military strength. However, over the past 2 days of observation, it was evident that the size of the Red Ant coalition at the front line had exceeded 500,000. Their relentless scavenging of areas near the border had left these regions overexploited and severely depleted, making it increasingly difficult to sustain their daily consumption. Luo Wen even witnessed several groups of red ants turning on black ants in their own ranks for food. The situation had reached a critical point. The Red Ant coalition now faced a choice, either launch an offensive or retreat. The probability of retreat was low, which meant that an all-out war between the two sides was imminent. Time was of the essence. Over 50,000 burrower ants were prepared, with 500 ants riding on each transport bug. In addition, more than 5,000 small soldier ants were accompanying the convoy to provide protection. Due to their smaller size, each transport bug could carry 800 to 900 of them. The team also included a small number of scout bugs and spy bugs. Under Luo Wen's command, over 100 transport bugs marched briskly into enemy-occupied territory, carefully avoiding areas under surveillance along the way. An hour later, the unit arrived at its designated location. This spot lay along the riverbank, about 600 meters from the red ant's brood nest. Without delay, Luo Wen began excavating a channel from a point half a meter from the riverbank. His massive body functioned like a giant excavator, carving out a trench that extended toward the red ant's nest. The burrower ants followed behind Luo Wen, removing the displaced soil, expanding, smoothing, and refining the trench. Meanwhile, the scout bugs and small soldier ants spread out around the team to maintain vigilance, and the transport bugs climbed the surrounding vegetation to fortify their positions. The operation proceeded in an orderly manner, and progress was swift. Luo Wen single-handedly tackled the most challenging tasks, his large digging claws tearing through the hardened earth, conserving the stamina of the burrower ants behind him. The plan unfolded smoothly. Although a few enemy scouts crossed their path, they were swiftly eliminated, providing the team with a modest supply of protein reserves. However, as the excavation neared the enemy's nest, they encountered an increasing number of enemy troops, with steadily growing forces. Even so, the small soldier ants maintained their numerical superiority. Transport bugs were also deployed to patrol the periphery, pursuing any fleeing enemies to prevent them from reporting back. Meanwhile, spy bugs erased any pheromone trails the enemies left behind. When the team was within 20 meters of the enemy's nest, their presence was finally exposed. The prolonged combat had drained the unit's stamina, and the proximity to the enemy's brood nest meant that patrols were more frequent in this area. Although the swarm still held a numerical advantage overall, they could no longer intercept all the fleeing enemy troops. Eventually, a few managed to slip away and spread the alarm. Fortunately, the distance to their target was now minimal, and ants were not the most efficient communicators. Luo Wen, deeply familiar with the rhythms of ant colony operations, understood that it would take some time for the red ants to react. Seizing this window of opportunity, he abandoned any pretense of concealment and pushed forward with full force, digging directly toward the mini-volcano ahead. Simultaneously, 20 transport bugs carrying 10,000 burrower ants sped back to the riverbank. Their mission was to breach the half-meter barrier separating the river from the trench. Although the departure of 1/5 of the workforce slightly slowed the excavation, the overall impact was manageable. After about 10 minutes, with the small soldier ants fighting valiantly to cover them, Luo Wen breached the mini-volcano's wall, creating a large hole that exposed the dark, winding tunnels of the enemy nest. This was like striking a hornet's nest. Swarms of red and black ants surged out from the breach. Exhausted from digging the 600-meter trench, Luo Wen was barely holding on. The final meters had been sheer willpower alone. Now that the task was complete, the fatigue hit him all at once. Even lifting his digging claws became a struggle. Remaining in the area was a death sentence. Summoning the last of his strength, Luo Wen retreated a short distance. The burrower ants moved ahead to shield him, standing firm as the bicolored flood of ants surged toward them. The burrower ants crouched, aiming their rears forward in standard spray formation. Acidic spray. Thousands of burrower ants unleashed their acidic solutions simultaneously, dousing the advancing vanguard in a wave of corrosive fluid. The enemy troops faltered, overwhelmed by the saturation attack. While an individual burrower ant didn't carry much acid, the combined output of thousands formed a river of acid. The liquid pooled on the surface, unable to seep into the soil, flowing directly into the nest's depths. Many enemies didn't even have time to react before their limbs and antennae dissolved in the acid stream. Struggling in vain, they succumbed to silence. Having withdrawn to the rear, Luo Wen began issuing commands. He ordered a few worker ants to scavenge ant remains from the battlefield so he could replenish his strength. Next, he directed 20,000 burrower ants to the volcano's mouth to block the entrance. Any enemy that emerged was greeted with a fresh spray of acid. The remaining burrower ants held the newly dug breach, ready to meet any escaping enemies with the same treatment. The small soldier ants and transport bugs guarded the flanks. Since the main force of the enemy was trapped inside the nest, the scattered patrols outside could still be held at bay. Half an hour later, despite several enemy charges, the swarm held firm, repelling each assault with concentrated acidic sprays. Using acid to block the tunnel entrance amplified its lethality exponentially, far surpassing its effectiveness in open-field battles. However, the repeated waves of self-sacrificial charges weren't without effect. The burrower ants' acid reserves were rapidly depleting. One more assault, and they'd likely run out. Just then, a distant rumbling reached their ears, the sound of rushing water. The trench, now filled with water, surged toward them, carrying the corpses of burrower ants that had sacrificed themselves to complete the task. Luo Wen knew all too well that the respiratory systems of insects like these were highly vulnerable to flooding. The final task of breaking the river's barrier had been perilous, and many had drowned in the attempt. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. Chapter 58 The Home Raid Ends. The water flowed continuously into the breach in the ant nest for a full 2 minutes. The surging current carried with it soil and a torrent of red and black ants, sweeping them out of the tunnels. At the entrance, the turbulent waters clashed back and forth before eventually stabilizing. The water level inside the nest equalized with the outside, and the surface of the water gradually calmed. Near the entrance, the water was littered with countless red and black ants. Most of them had not drowned immediately and were still desperately struggling on the surface. Some of the luckier ones managed to climb onto the bodies of their companions and painstakingly make their way to the riverbank, where they struggled to crawl ashore. However, what awaited them on land were the burrower ants, standing ready to strike. The terrain inside the nest was complex, and only a small fraction of the ants had been swept out by the water, the majority had perished below. This raid on the enemy's brood nest exterminated tens of thousands of red and black ants, at the very least. Most importantly, their stockpiled food reserves in the nest were completely destroyed. This blow exacerbated their already strained frontline supply situation. After eliminating the lucky survivors who made it ashore, the ants in the water stopped struggling one by one and began to float silently on the surface. Luo Wen ordered the burrower ants to turn back and support the small soldier ants, using up the last of their acidic reserves. While the combat strength of the burrower ants couldn't compare to the small soldier ants, their sheer numbers overwhelmed the battlefield in an instant. After clearing the battlefield, all corpses, friend and foe alike, were collected and processed into protein reserves. The army then boarded the transport bugs and quickly retreated toward the riverbank. Having just destroyed the enemy's nest, it was wise to leave the area quickly to avoid a frenzied counterattack from their frontline forces. Upon reaching the riverbank, the group regrouped with the burrower ants stationed there. A count revealed that of the 10,000 burrower ants who had breached the final barrier, only about 6,000 remained. Nearly 4,000 had been swept away by the rushing water in an instant. Adding to this were the losses from the final stretch of digging and the subsequent battle. Over 3,000 burrower ants were lost. The 5,000 strong small soldier ant force was reduced to fewer than 3,000, with nearly half falling in battle. Even among the robust transport bugs, 2 units had been lost. This battle cost over 10,000 troops from various classes, but the victory was spectacular. After a brief recovery, Luo Wen ordered the entire force to retreat. They traveled along the riverbank, carefully avoiding enemy patrols. The exhausted army couldn't endure any more disruptions. Fortunately, the journey back was uneventful. The army returned safely to the frontline command center, a location Luo Wen had ceremoniously named but was, in reality, just the nearest forward base. Currently, this base had become a major gathering point for the swarm. Excluding the returning burrower ants, there were still around 150,000 worker ants stationed here. The small soldier ants, due to their late production schedule, were still relatively few in number. Even with the addition of the 2,000 that just returned, their total barely reached 30,000. However, there were still over 10,000 original soldier ants from earlier generations. Including the transport bugs, the total number of combat-ready troops was just over 200,000. Even with the addition of the burrower ants, the number barely reached 250,000. Furthermore, the burrower ants had expended all their acidic reserves, reducing their combat effectiveness by at least half for the next few days. The enemy still had at least 500,000 troops, more than double the swarm's forces. Fortunately, about 70% of the enemy troops were black ants, and with Luo Wen's command, there was still a chance of victory. Moreover, the destruction of the enemy's brood nest created severe supply issues for their forces. While the swarm's rear lines were stretched thin due to the allocation of troops to the front, they could still barely maintain normal operations. Over time, Luo Wen's chances of winning would only increase. Thus, the swarm's current strategy was to hold their position, delay the conflict, and adapt to the situation. However, the Red and Black Ant coalition had no intention of giving Luo Wen the luxury of time. Early the next morning, just as dawn broke, their densely packed forces crossed the border, advancing on the swarm's base. Despite the abrupt timing, Luo Wen remained unfazed. He had long prepared for this decisive battle. The only difference was that the longer the delay, the fewer casualties his swarm would suffer. Having absorbed countless pieces of intelligence, Luo Wen's unparalleled intellect allowed him to craft an elaborate trap. The enemy's rapid discovery of the swarm's base was no coincidence, it was all part of Luo Wen's plan. Rather than fight on an uncontrollable battlefield, Luo Wen had deliberately prepared a stage for the enemy, ensuring the confrontation would play out on his terms. With the scout bug's superior vision, every movement of the enemy army was under Luo Wen's watchful eye. As the enemy forces advanced, small swarm detachments continuously appeared in their path, strategically retreating to lure them closer to the base. The stage was already set, now, the actors just needed to enter. The bait squads gradually returned, retreating into the base's tunnels. The Red and Black Ant coalition arrived shortly after, their sheer numbers staining the ground in a tapestry of red and black. When they reached the swarm's base, they found the surface eerily clean. There were no signs of life, only a dark, funnel-shaped hole gaping like an ominous eye in the earth. Faced with this abyss-like entrance, the coalition hesitated not a moment. The nimble and aggressive red ants led the charge, diving headfirst into the tunnel. Once inside, they encountered a long passageway. Crawling through it, they entered a massive chamber. Here, they were met with a brutal ambush. Dozens of giant mandible soldier ants were stationed around the tunnel entrance. The moment a red ant poked its head out, it was grabbed and flung back into the chamber, where swarms of small soldier ants swarmed over it to finish the kill. While this bottleneck tactic was insufficient to eliminate an army of 500,000, it effectively stalled them. The giant mandible soldier ants rotated in shifts. Once a group exhausted their strength, they withdrew, replaced by fresh reinforcements. The red ants at the front were picked off one by one, while those at the rear, unaware of the situation, continued to surge forward. Occasionally, a group would burst through the defenses or be pushed forward by the press of their comrades, only to face overwhelming numbers in the chamber beyond, where they were swiftly overwhelmed. Though the passage was relatively wide, it was still too narrow for the sheer size of the enemy army. Only a small fraction could enter at a time. After losing over 10,000 troops in half a day, the rear forces began to grow restless. Smaller groups broke away from the main force to forage in the surrounding area. Unbeknownst to them, their movements were closely monitored by the scout bugs. As soon as they strayed from the main force, they were met by the swarm's mobile units, who had been sharpening their claws in anticipation. Chapter 59, Attrition. The swarm deployed its units in small groups of a few hundred, each consisting of scout bugs, soldier ants, small soldier ants, and worker ants. Every squad was accompanied by a transport bug, tasked with patrolling around the enemy forces to intercept and annihilate their foraging teams. A foraging team of approximately 500 ants had ventured less than 50 meters from their main force when they were intercepted by two mobile swarm squads. 500 versus 1,000, and with the smaller group possessing inferior individual combat power, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Each red ant had to face at least two worker ants. Although the worker ants relied on superior numbers and size, their primary tactic was to engage in prolonged skirmishes. The red ants' stinger attacks were indeed formidable, capable of defeating targets significantly larger than themselves. However, stinger strikes had a critical weakness: to target an armored opponent, the red ants needed to climb onto the enemy, secure themselves, and find vulnerable spots like armor joints to pierce with their stingers. The worker ants countered this by remaining highly mobile. Every time a red ant curled its abdomen in preparation for a stinger attack, the worker ants would dodge out of reach. Even if a red ant managed to grab hold of one, nearby worker ants would promptly intervene, pulling the red ant away. Despite the effectiveness of these tactics, unexpected events still occurred. Some worker ants were caught and stung during the battle. Nevertheless, the red ant coalition fell faster than the swarm sustained losses. Combining the efforts of the soldier ants and small soldier ants, the swarm prioritized eliminating the weaker black ants. The black ants, with their inferior combat abilities and lack of the worker ants' agility, were swiftly eradicated under the soldier ants' onslaught. Once the weaker opponents were dealt with, the soldier ants surrounded the red ants still entangled with the worker ants. The red ants, which had barely held their ground moments ago, began to fall rapidly. Their defeat snowballed, and in the end, only about 50 red ants managed to break through and flee back toward their main force in panic. The previously idle transport bugs now sprang into action, chasing down the fleeing red ants. Along the way, they eliminated over a dozen more before turning back, stopping about 20 meters from the enemy's main force. With their long legs and superior speed, the transport bugs retreated effortlessly. During the skirmish, the swarm lost 2 small soldier ants and over a dozen worker ants. Their bodies, along with those of the enemy, were quickly loaded onto the backs of the transport bugs. The squads then retreated to a hidden location, where they uncovered a passage concealed by a leaf. The worker ants carried their spoils into the tunnel and delved deeper into the earth. This tunnel was one of the concealed entrances to a branch base. Luo Wen, ever cautious, had constructed over a dozen escape routes even when he was operating alone. Now, with a decisive battle underway, there was no way he would rely on just one entrance and exit. The tunnel used for the enemy's invasion was deliberately designed as a trap to lure them in. Similarly, the plan to flood the coalition's brood nest had been formulated after Luo Wen observed that their nest had only one entrance, the so-called volcano mouth. The devastation he witnessed at the nest further reinforced his belief in the importance of having multiple escape routes. After a short while, the worker ants emerged from the hidden tunnel, climbed onto waiting transport bugs, and swiftly departed. Once they left, several spy bugs crawled out of the tunnel, erasing pheromone traces left behind. They then resealed the entrance. In addition to the spy bugs, numerous burrower ants were stationed inside the tunnel. Their task was to collapse the passage and bury it should the enemy discover it, ensuring the safety of their allies within. Elsewhere on the battlefield, a mobile swarm squad was leading a 2,000 strong coalition force on a wild chase. Just ahead, 10 more mobile squads lay in ambush, waiting for the coalition forces to arrive. 2,000 versus 5,500. The result was inevitable. The only question was how many of the coalition forces would survive to retreat. Thanks to their superior mobility and visual range, the swarm's mobile squads maintained the advantage of fighting outnumbered enemies, steadily whittling down the coalition's numbers. Faced with constant harassment and the continued loss of their foraging teams, the coalition's main force finally grew restless. They began regrouping to sweep the surrounding areas. Luo Wen quickly detected their movements and issued orders for the swarm blocking the tunnel entrance to retreat, leaving the passage open. Immediately, the coalition forces trapped in the tunnel surged forward, pouring into the massive underground chamber. As their numbers grew, worker ants hidden along the chamber walls and ceiling assumed their acid spray formation. Acid rained down like a torrential storm, drenching the unprepared coalition forces. The attack was devastating. Those fortunate enough only lost their antennae, while the less lucky had their exoskeletons corroded, dying instantly. After the acid downpour, the giant mandible soldier ants resumed their positions, sealing the passage once again. With much of the coalition force cleared from the tunnel, the soldier ants now found themselves with a rare moment of respite. The small soldier ants and worker ants charged into the chamber, finishing off any survivors and carrying their bodies deeper into the nest. Initially intending to eliminate the swarm's harassing squads, the coalition hesitated when they found the tunnel unexpectedly cleared. Torn between attacking the nest and continuing their sweep, they eventually chose to press forward into the tunnel. Once again, waves of coalition forces flooded into the passage, only to face renewed acid attacks and countermeasures from the swarm. Whenever the coalition forces grew impatient and prepared to withdraw, Luo Wen would order the tunnel to be reopened, allowing more of them inside just in time for another acid barrage. Fortunately for Luo Wen, the red and black ants lacked complex strategic thinking. They fell for this simple tactic repeatedly over 2 full days. During this time, the underground nest became a graveyard for over 100,000 enemy soldiers. Meanwhile, the swarm's mobile units annihilated at least another 50,000 coalition troops. However, the swarm itself lost more than 10,000 of its own. The swarm converted the fallen into protein reserves, temporarily achieving self-sufficiency through sustenance via combat at the forward base. Instead of transporting food to the forward base, the transport bugs now redirected supplies to nearby hive bases, where 50 queen ants worked tirelessly to produce small soldier ants. Additionally, the 100 other hive bases across the territory were no less busy. While their genetic libraries couldn't be updated, they focused entirely on producing worker ants and giant mandible soldier ants. The reinforcements were then transported by transport bugs to the vicinity of the front lines. Chapter 60 Consumption. Despite losing over 100,000 troops in the past 2 days, the Red and Black Ant Coalition continued to receive reinforcements from their rear territory, keeping their total numbers above 500,000. Meanwhile, Luo Wen's swarm steadily bolstered its ranks with new arrivals from the territory. The total swarm force had grown to nearly 300,000. The gap in troop strength between the two sides was gradually narrowing. Finally, the coalition realized they could no longer allow Luo Wen to continue his attritional tactics. Gathering their forces, they ignored the emptied underground tunnels and the persistent harassment by swarm squads, marching en masse past the underground base and deeper into swarm territory. Perched on the trunk of a plant along their path, Luo Wen estimated the coalition's composition. The ratio of red ants to black ants was now about 1:9. Most of the red ants, having spearheaded earlier assaults, had been severely depleted during the battles at the underground base. Although the coalition still numbered over 500,000, their overall combat effectiveness had significantly diminished. In the central ranks of the coalition, Luo Wen spotted several massive red ants. These ants were dozens of times the size of ordinary red ants, with distinctive, swollen abdomens that marked them as queen ants of the red ant species. These queens had not been present during Luo Wen's earlier reconnaissance. Clearly, they had arrived with reinforcements from the rear. What surprised Luo Wen even more was that these queens coexisted peacefully, suggesting that red ants might be a multi-queen species. Their whole family migration strategy gave Luo Wen an oddly familiar sense of déjà vu. After a moment of thought, it struck him this was the swarm's own classic strategy, the move the entire hive tactic. To think these red ants, with their limited intelligence, could conceive such a strategy amused Luo Wen. However, their execution was flawed. The essence of this tactic was to fortify one's own base to stall the enemy's main force, while using the rest of the army to capture the enemy's headquarters. Instead, the coalition was attempting to forcibly migrate while the swarm army was right beside them. It was suicidal. Emerging from their underground base, the concealed swarm surged out to engage the coalition's rear guard. The two armies clashed like tidal waves. Transport bugs, carrying worker ants, spearheaded the assault, unleashing a round of ranged attacks to incapacitate portions of the enemy force and sow chaos before quickly withdrawing. The predominantly black ant coalition, lacking stingers, had no effective counter to the swift, hit-and-run tactics of the long-legged transport bugs. Even when a black ant managed to latch onto a transport bug's limb, nearby transport bugs would swiftly kill it. The acid spray attacks, though less effective in open environments than in the confined underground tunnels, still served to disorient and scatter the enemy. Many ants with corroded antennae turned into aimless wanderers, creating disorder within the coalition's rear ranks. In no time, tens of thousands of their troops were thrown into chaos, disconnected from their vanguard. Seizing the opportunity, the pursuing swarm accelerated their assault, engaging the disorganized coalition in fierce melee combat on open ground. Although individual black ants were weak, the sheer scale of a melee involving tens of thousands of troops made differences in individual strength less significant. Even Luo Wen, with his superior combat ability, could be overwhelmed if surrounded by the enemy. He was always reminded of the grim fate of the spider he once encountered. In the chaos, a red ant managed to grapple a worker ant and drive its stinger into the worker ant's abdomen, only to be impaled moments later by a passing transport bug. Both combatants perished in the skirmish, locked together in death. Elsewhere, a giant mandible soldier ant, having advanced too far, was surrounded by dozens of black ants. Some tore at its limbs, while others targeted its joints. By the time reinforcements arrived, the soldier ant had only 2 legs remaining. Though rescued, it could no longer move and would be processed for protein recovery. The battlefield was a scene of relentless carnage, with hundreds or thousands of ants perishing every moment. Words failed to capture the ferocity of the combat. Without the advantage of terrain, the swarm suffered heavier losses in direct engagements, even with their superior strength. However, as more swarm mobile units arrived, the coalition forces, which had initially held their own, began to falter. The coalition's reliance on pheromones for communication proved inefficient. By the time news of their rearguard's plight reached their command and decisions were relayed back, the swarm had already obliterated the rear forces, looted their remains, and retreated. Frustrated, the coalition launched a full-scale pursuit. Yet the trail left by the swarm indicated that their forces had split into several retreating groups. Lacking strategic knowledge, the coalition impulsively divided their army to chase after the swarm. Following the pheromone trails led them to further branching paths, where they divided again. These misleading pheromones, left by spy bugs under Luo Wen's orders, were intended to slow the coalition's pursuit. Luo Wen hadn't expected the coalition to divide so readily, but he wasn't about to let the opportunity go to waste. He ordered spy bugs to create more branching trails. Meanwhile, the swarm regrouped and consumed part of their spoils to replenish their strength. After a brief regrouping, Luo Wen mobilized approximately 150,000 troops, though another 100,000 swarm forces were scattered across the area. While Luo Wen had dispatched messengers to locate these mobile units, he hoped they would avoid blundering into the coalition's main force. After repeated splits, the coalition's forces were fragmented. Aside from the main force guarding the queens, which still numbered over 200,000, the remaining units were reduced to smaller groups of 20,000 to 30,000 each. Luo Wen lured one such 20,000 strong detachment away from the main army, ambushing it with a 150,000 strong swarm contingent riding on transport bugs. The smaller force was completely surrounded, with not a single ant escaping. The disparity in numbers and individual combat power rendered the battle one-sided. The smaller coalition force was annihilated with minimal swarm losses. Luo Wen then led his forces in a circuit around the coalition, repeatedly baiting and eliminating isolated detachments. Though the tactics were simple, they proved consistently effective. Luo Wen couldn't help but feel a sense of detachment. As an ordinary human employing military strategy against insects, he felt as if he were bullying them with his superior intellect.